With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Hi, welcome back to Heard Tell. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Thank you for joining us wherever you are across the street around the world. Appreciate you being here. We'll try to turn down the noise of the news cycle a little bit. Also have some fun. We got one story in particular. It's a little different, but this is the week between holidays. We get to do a little different things here. Still try to focus on things that matter. Skip the things that don't. Try to do our best to discern the times we live in. I want to start right there with that statement. I say it on purpose. I get things right. I get things wrong. Occasionally over at Ordinary Times, I used to write a column about things that I got wrong. Haven't been doing as much writing. Maybe I had to bust one of those out, but I get things wrong all the time. The point isn't trying to be always right. It's trying to find the truth. It's trying to understand what's going on. So when we get something wrong, we just come out and say we get it wrong. Or if we get it right, we come out and say we got it right and try not to gloat about it too much, although sometimes you have to have a little bit of fun. Let's be honest here. I say all that to get to this point. Sometimes you take some criticism, and that's fine. Look, I do things like Twitter and this show and other things using my real name. You get my face, you get my opinions. I write, I do media, I do other media hits, I do TV hits, I do radio hits. I put my stuff out there. You can criticize it. I signed up for that. You get a certain amount of mess when you do what I do. And that's fine. God bless. I love freedom of speech. I love freedom of expression. As long as you don't threaten to kill or burn down my house or attack my children or whatever, although that's happened a time or two. God bless. Have fun. Have your own show. Bring your own opinion. Heck, you got a dissenting opinion about something I wrote, send it to me. Might even run it if it's written up pretty well. We might help you run it. I've actually done that, by the way. Somebody said, well, I didn't like your opinion. I said, write it up. Send it to me. They were shocked. And I posted it and published it. I'm not against dissenting opinions. But I got a little pushback on something, so I want to address it. Let's go out to Arizona. Kari Lake, who ran for governor and lost. Yes, she lost. Once again, had her court case thrown out right before Christmas, so you might have missed it in the thing. I'm going to condense a couple things because here's how this argument goes. The people that are absolutely convinced that every election they lost is stolen will get down into the minutia of something and, oh, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Okay, it went to court. All right. Kari Lake brought 10 counts. 8 of them were so weak they didn't even make it to a hearing, and the other 2 made it into a hearing and barely lasted that long before they were all found to be utterly frivolous and ridiculous. Here's where I go back to that first part I tell you. I don't just sit here and say stuff for the fun of it. Things like this, I've read through the court documents. I've watched most of the relevant testimony. I've talked to people there. I reach out to folks. When I talk about stuff in Congress, most of the time, I'll reach out to one of our friends that cover Congress or some other source that knows what they're talking about, and I try to talk to them. I read as much as I can. I don't just sit here and spout off. With this Kari Lake stuff, I read the documents. You can read them yourself. It's all in PDF format. It's all free. You can find it. It's something we do at Ordinary Times. We put a lot of these rulings out. Read the documents for themselves. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. Matter of fact, I can read you part of the findings right now. They're little one-word sentences. Look at this. The court does not find clear and convincing evidence of misconduct in violation of, and it has the criminal code. The court does not find clear and convincing evidence that such misconduct was committed by, quote, an officer or participating in a canvass. The court does not find clear and convincing evidence that such misconduct was intended to affect the result of the 2022 general election. The court does not find clear and convincing evidence that such misconduct did, in fact, affect the result. The court does not find clear and convincing evidence of misconduct, on and on and on. That's not legalese. That's not hard to understand. It's not hard to understand that most of these things got thrown out. It's not hard to understand the timing of these, by the way, that the things, why they bring them after the certification happened when they know that it's not going to get overthrown because they need to do that for their fundraising reasons and to keep their profiles high. What do we say all the time? Actions, not words. Now, this is so bad that the folks that or the defendants here are actually asking for sanctions against the lawyers that brought it. I've talked to a couple of legal experts. They think that's probably too harsh and overbearing, and they may not get that. This is not like the Sidney Powell situation where it was so bad that everybody involved is probably going to be railroaded out of the legal profession. This isn't that bad, is what I've been told, but we'll see. Maybe they'll sanction him, but it sounds like they probably won't be. The case in point here is there was no election fraud here. There's some isolated cases like there always was. The reason Kari Lake lost is because she lost. And there's been some really good reporting on this. Here's the thing, you don't need it. You can go off what she did herself. Don't tell John McCain Republicans, don't come vote for me in a state John McCain won over and over again. Don't start putting together your administration before you finished out your campaign and get your hubris going, like has been now widely reported. Kari Lake underperformed Donald Trump, not because the ballots got tampered with or because the election was rigged, but because she turned off a bunch of people in a very purple state. She could have ran a better campaign. She could have ran a little bit more moderately. She could have turned it down a little bit. She decided to not to, and she lost to, frankly, not a very good candidate in Katie Hobbs. She didn't run a good campaign at all. You couldn't even find her. She didn't debate. She disappeared. She wasn't good on TV when she was on TV. That's not an indictment that Kari Lake was cheated. It's an indictment that Kari Lake wasn't a very good candidate. Sorry, run better candidates. It goes for you, Pennsylvania, Mehmet Oz. What did you think was going to happen? Mastriano for governor in a state like Pennsylvania with the history it has and the electorate that it has? What did you think was going to happen? You have to run better candidates. So you can go ahead and crow about people cheating on mail-in ballots and all this. Listen, well, this got said under oath and testimony. Yes, it also got cross-examined. Did you listen to that clip too, or did you just believe something that somebody on Twitter said? I did. Go listen to it. There was no compelling testimony that anything untoward here happened. There was some incompetence. There were some people that probably shouldn't be in the jobs they are, but no, they didn't rig an election against you. Don't just listen to that internet clip. Don't just listen to that Twitter thread. Read through it. Testimony has two sides. It has the testimony and the cross-examine. You need to listen to both sides of that before you make a decision. Yes, there's probably a couple people in here that's going to be in real trouble afterwards, like we've seen in some other elections. But this election denial nonsense needs to stop, because what's going to happen is we're going to really have some election shenanigans. We're going to really have somebody try to steal an election, and they may get away with it because we've been crying wolf so much on every single election. That's both sides, by the way. I was there. I remember when Trump won and our Democratic friends went off on a tangent about how obviously it was stolen. Everybody's got dirty hands here. We all need to stop it. Now, you can go ahead and accuse me of both sides, but I'll stop doing it when both sides stop doing it. Our election integrity is important, but you're not acting like it's important if you just keep howling about how elections are rigged when you lose one. We need to take this seriously. We need to stick to the facts on the ground. Don't just listen to that person on Twitter or that personality you like. Go do your own research. Read up on it. Read the court documents. Read what really happened. Get you a rotation of good reporters that know what they're talking about. Especially these kind of elections, there's people in every state that are experts in what they're doing. Make sure you're following them. Turn down the noise. Get to the truth. And the truth is, Kari Lake lost, and she only has Kari Lake to blame for it. Everything else is noise. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Two headlines in the Washington Post that are both trending items, and they completely go together. The first headline, Republicans making moves towards entering 2024 primary against Trump. The other headline that is related, hitting back at Trump, Biden gears up for more clashes with the GOP. Now, of course, this is all about 2024. Yes, we're already in the next election cycle. Hope you enjoyed the midterms. Let's get on to 2024. See, there's narratives to be had, and there's newspapers to sell, and clicks to be had, and coverage has got to be gone, and we got to write stories, folks. Keep this political machine going. So we got to get right into the next campaign. President Biden, yes, skip all that noise. He's running for re-election, unless something, God forbid, happens to him personally. He's going to run for re-election. And as we've covered on this program before, if you're a Democrat, he's your best chance to win by far. It's not particularly close, so just accept it and push on and enjoy it. Now, here's the thing about these two headlines going together is all this depends on who you want to see run, who you want to see win, and how you do it. They're both well-written pieces. I'm not criticizing. I'm not even criticizing coverage. I just want to talk big picture for a minute about what we're going to be doing for the next 2 years now. It's all going to be horse race. We have to hurry up and get to the 1v1 races or the 1v1 races in the primary since Biden's going to go unopposed on the Republican side. We got to get to these 1v1 races because that's what sells the contest of ideas. Now, the one problem with all these GOP people running is the people that are running are already running. Just pay attention. Did they just put a book out? Are they doing media tours? Do they already have staffs? Those are easy enough to find out. Have they filed paperwork for their fundraising stuff? Not words, actions. You can look all this stuff up yourself. If they've already got the paperwork for their campaigns to fundraise, they're running. If they did a book tour that is talking about how wonderful a leader they are, they're running. If they're doing a media tour, they're running. Now, they may not have declared yet, and they may bail out before we ever get anywhere near the first primaries, but they're running. Just watch their actions, not their words. Same thing here with this Biden piece, though. It's something we have talked about before on this program, and you need to pay very close attention to. The Joe Biden presidency for the next 2 years is not the Joe Biden presidency of the last 2 years. Last 2 years, they had nominally control over the Senate, 50-50 Senate with the tie-breaking vote with Vice President Harris, and they had the House under Speaker Pelosi, and of course, President Biden. And they got a lot of things done. They got some legislation through that, frankly, surprised a lot of people. But for all intents and purposes, the Democrats had themselves a pretty good legislative run there. Now the Republicans are taking over the House coming up. This is going to be a problem. Now, the other thing going on is the Democrats not only have the majority in the Senate, and yes, I know Sinema went independent, but there was obviously a deal struck there because she kept her committee assignments. Her and Schumer are fine. She'll go off the reservation here and there, but she's still going to mostly vote for the Democrats to just settle down a little bit. They have a 51-seat majority, even though it's 50-50 now, but they get not just the committee chairmanships now, they'll actually have majorities on those seats. That's a very important thing. So going forward, here's the dynamic. You're going to have a GOP-controlled Congress that's already announced they're going to do a lot of quote-unquote revenge hearings. They're going to do a lot of the Hunter Biden stuff. They're going to go over President Biden after about anything they can get their hands on. They're probably not going to be able to legislate a whole lot because the Senate, as we just mentioned, is already in hands. And that leaves President Biden in a different position. It's not his fault now because his party doesn't control everything. He now gets to run against a GOP-controlled House. And let's be frank here, this GOP-controlled House is going to be an absolute circus. They can't even get the Kevin McCarthy speakership thing wrapped up in due course as we still sit here waiting on that to happen. It's a mess, and it's going to be a continuing mess. That caucus is not going to be controllable, especially by somebody like Kevin McCarthy, who's not respected, not well liked, and hasn't really shown any particular aptitude at the job for that matter. Then we have the whole Trump sphere out there and what might happen with that. Plus, we have all the other people running for president on the GOP side. Plus, you're probably going to have another couple senators jump in there somewhere. This is going to be a very different dynamic than the last 2 years. There's two things politically that could have really helped the 2024 reelection bid of Joe Biden. And one of them just happened. The GOP takes the House. That sounds a little counterintuitive, but think about it. He now has somebody to run against. He has a foil. He can blame them for nothing getting passed for the next couple of years. They're going to fight him constantly. It's going to solidify his base. It's going to help his fundraising. And he's going to have a foil to work off of as he builds his campaign for 2024. That's the second best thing that could possibly happen to him. The number one thing, if Trump's the nominee, we're going to have to wait a little while to see how that one plays out. But right now, if you're President Biden, all things considered, your 2024 run, feeling pretty good right now, and see how it shakes out. Now, as far as that GOP primary and how that's going to go, there has been some movement on certain things. Don't just get caught up in the noise. Who's filing paperwork? Who, like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, all of a sudden started running national ads on Google and other online platforms here in the last few days? Who's raising their national profile? Who's writing books? Who's doing speeches? Who's going on shows? That tells you who's really running. Turn down the noise. Don't get caught up in who's running and who's not. They'll tell you through their actions. and turn down the horse race stuff a little bit and pay attention to what's really going on. We've got 2 years of this, folks. Pace yourselves. Don't get wrapped up in it just right now. Let it play out. We're all going to get there at the same time, no matter what. It's kind of like driving between stoplights. You can drive crazy and you just wind up right behind the guy that was speeding anyway. Just relax. We're going to get all there together. We'll link to both these pieces. Read them for yourselves, but keep that in mind. Biden's in a pretty good spot right now. You got to get the title off the champ by knocking him out. You're not going to do it by inertia. And the GOP has a bit of a mess in their primary to get through. We are blessed, or maybe cursed, to live in interesting political times for the next 2 years, folks. Don't worry, we'll get through it together. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, here's a fella we always enjoy talking to a great deal. Aadi Golchha down in New Zealand coming back. He's also the host of the Economic Review podcast. Real sharp fella. Going to talk a little economics, a little regulation today. Aadi, how are you, sir? Welcome back to the program.
I'm great. Always a pleasure to be on with you.
I really appreciate it. Let's start some big picture stuff because you're down in New Zealand right now. You obviously follow American economics and politics quite a bit. I want to zoom out a little bit because American press, especially when it comes to economics, gets pretty insular and they kind of have their narrative lanes. Give me a big picture view of what's going on globally economically. We know, of course, there's things going on with China. There's the war in Ukraine that's got everything kind of moving around, especially in sectors like logistics and energy and things like this. We have what's going on in Africa. Give me a couple things that you're paying attention to globally, the big stories that people are missing because we get caught up in, cost of living and things like that. Not that they're not important, but sometimes we miss the forest for the trees on things like economics, don't we?
I think the one thing that probably an American audience would be most surprised by are the similarities between the American economic climate and the economic climate that the rest of the world is dealing with. So if you're used to watching American media, whether you lean left or you lean right, you probably have in mind a couple of causes for, say, the high inflation rate, right? If you're on the left, you might blame corporate greed. If you're on the right, you might think this is Joe Biden's doing. He shut down the gas pipelines, and that's why gas prices are so high. But if you start to zoom out a little bit, you'll notice that Europe's dealing with the same thing. Here in New Zealand, we're dealing with the exact same thing. Grocery prices are up, gas prices are up. Joe Biden doesn't have anything to do with New Zealand, but we're dealing with all the same issues in almost exactly the same fashion as the United States. And I don't think that experience is at all out of the ordinary. So zooming out, I think a lot of places have been hard hit by supply chain issues, by the Russia-Ukraine war being fought at the epicenter of all these crucial commodities. So I think there are quite a few global problems that are affecting the world economy and the climate and the pain that a lot of countries are feeling. And I think that it's very hard at the moment to know where the economy is going. I think a lot of central banks here in New Zealand, and I know in the US as well, have projected that they're going to keep on raising interest rates, and that the economic downturn is going to continue through 2023. I have no reason to believe that's not going to be the case, and it seems that every indicator so far points that's going to be the case, not just in the US but around the world.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha joining us. What is it different that, like, we've seen inflation a lot throughout history for a lot of reasons. You have countries like Turkey's having high inflation even before the current crisis because bad management, frankly. The late 40s, early 50s. We've seen it through the 70s. We saw it, of course, after World War I in Germany, which was catastrophic and led to another world war in a lot of ways. Inflation isn't new. Seeing it globally everywhere all at once, that is a little bit new. We haven't seen that as much. I know the world is globally economically integrated now. how different is it that this is a global inflation? Almost all countries are feeling this a little differently, not just one or two, as compared to just when even a major country like the U.S. having inflation. That changes it a little bit, and that's a little different perspective, and a little bit more unique, isn't it?
So I think the most fundamental rule in economics is supply and demand. So anytime you see prices going up, it's because either supply has gone down or demand has gone up. And in this case, I think for just about any country in the world, you can say that both of those factors have taken place at the same time. So whether it's Europe, whether it's the United States, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, wherever, I think a reality throughout the pandemic was that a lot of these economies were shut down, and in an effort to stop the economy from falling into a depression, governments around the world did pump unprecedented amounts of money into the economy. There was a lot of new money printing. I know there was like a 12-month period in the U.S. where those 12 months, 40% of all U.S. dollars ever created were created within those 12 months. And the same thing here in New Zealand, right? We had insane amounts of wage subsidies and unemployment benefits, stimulus checks. All those things were reality here. There were reality in Europe and everywhere else. So demand definitely went up. People had more money. There was more money in the economy. And then the other side, there were definitely supply chain issues. So I think China, which manufactures a lot of the goods and services that we around the world all consume, stuck for a very long time into their zero COVID policy, very, very strict lockdowns, very strict restrictions that did affect supply chains, lockdowns and all sorts of other regulations in all different parts of the world did bring the supply chain to a halt. And I think the effects of that are more catastrophic, given how interconnected the economy is now. Perhaps 200 years ago, if different parts of the world shut down, the effect wouldn't have rippled through the world as it does today. And so I think both of those factors coming together at the same time creates a perfect storm for inflation just about anywhere.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha joining us. You just mentioned it. These are ripples. Economics. A major country like China, like the U.S., when they have economic things happen, that ship turns real slow, right? That's not a speedboat. That's an oil tanker. China is now apparently backing off those COVID restrictions. They've seen what's going on. This is going to take a while to trickle through the rest of the global economy, including the supply chains, things like that. How long does it take for something like what China has done with their zero COVID policy to really come back to whatever they were doing before, or to at least change from what they were doing? Are we talking months? Are we talking quarters? Are we talking years, do you think? Because we've seen in America, of course, we're still feeling the effects of the COVID shutdowns. China was even more severe. What are you looking at economically here? Are you looking at a couple of quarters? Are you looking at a year or two? What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of factors that go into determining something like an economic recovery, especially from something as severe as what we just experienced. I think I don't think there's anyone in the world that can give you sort of like an exact timeline on 6 months from now everything will be back to normal. I think it depends a lot on China, the way the Chinese government handles it. The Chinese government has a lot of fiscal policy, monetary policy tools at its disposal. I know, for example, China keeps a very high reserve ratio on its banks, and so cutting that reserve ratio would instantly release billions of yuan into circulation. And so there are certainly tools at the CCP's disposal should it wish to use them to sort of speed up the process of economic recovery. But besides that, I think there's a lot of things. The Chinese. The property bust. I did a piece on this a couple of months ago. There are some major issues with China's property market, which is a large part of the economy. And so if that were to go bust, that could prolong the recession for a lot longer than any of us can foresee at the moment.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha. Let's talk about those supply chains. You talked about supply and demand. Well, you got to get the the supply and demand. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. We just had this rail strike issue in the U.S. You took a comparison to that to truck drivers. Now, there's a lot more truck drivers than rail workers, and it's a little bit different situation. But before we get into it, the core of your piece and the core of what you're talking about here is something that we've actually been debating quite a bit lately when it comes to things like the gig economy. And it's the legal definition and the economic incentives of independent contractors. This is not a new debate. This is something that's been going on for a long time in a lot of things. But this is one of those things where regulation and technology have kind of converged on the moment to really bring a head on what is and isn't an independent contractor. Let's get the nomenclature right so that we're understanding what we're talking about here, especially when it comes to these truck drivers. This is an industry I work in. I know it very well. Independent contractors, it's not universally good or bad. Some folks like it, some folks don't like it, but big businesses can abuse that terminology. Just walk us through the terminology there on what independent contracting means, especially when it comes to these truck drivers.
So I think in the conventional sense, an independent contractor is somebody who, for example, think about it. If you hire someone to mow your lawn, that person would be an independent contractor. They're not your employee. You don't pay for their social security. You don't pay for workers' benefits. You don't pay FICA. Any of those things. They're independent. They do a job for you. They work on their own schedule. All those things. That's what makes someone independent. And most importantly of all, they're not exclusively your employee. They can go and mow my neighbor's lawns and 10 other lawns as well. And so I think that sort of that's typically what we think of when we think of an independent contractor. And they're usually responsible for paying for their own expenses. They're responsible for paying for their own taxes and everything else. And on the other hand, an employee is what most people are classified as in their jobs. So, if you work at Walmart, for example, then you would be an employee. You work exclusively for one company. You wear the Walmart uniform. You work during the hours and in the manner specified by Walmart. You work for you're an employee of a company, and all the sort of characteristics of that. In the U.S., I think that distinction at times gets very, very muddy, because a contract can overpower everything. So, in the context of truck driving, a trucking company can make its workers operate exactly like an employee. For example, you'll see the FedEx trucks, you'll see Amazon trucks. The people driving them are wearing FedEx uniforms. They're wearing Amazon uniforms. They're working for that company exclusively. They're using the company's trucks. They're working on the hours, the routes, the timings. Everything is specified by the company. They have no discretion over how they do their jobs, when they do their jobs. And yet they're classified as independent contractors. Why? Because it says so on their contract that they signed. And I think what myself and a lot of other people would argue for is that there should be some actual meaning. The term independent contractor and employee should actually mean something beyond I signed a piece of paper and that's the only difference.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha joining us now. Truck driving, where this really gets sticky, especially when it comes to those bigger companies that you're talking about. There's a difference between independent contractors and trucking, because you have owner operators, which is exactly what it sounds like. They own their own truck, they own their own equipment, and then they take runs just like a freelance rider, like an Uber driver. They take clients or runs or contracts to go and do their stuff, but they own all their stuff. Where this gets a little predatory, in my opinion, but it can be good for certain individuals. Again, this isn't university, is the lease owner operators. And that's where this really starts getting sticky and icky. And you started touching on that on your piece. And this is really where the legislation is non-specific, but it really, really has to be. And it's really important for these workers. And it's really important for the economy, because we saw, like in California with the port situation, where they didn't do a carve out for those lease owner operators. Regulation just about wiped them out in one fell swoop just because of the language of legislation. Talk about that for a second, because that's one of those little points of minutia people don't talk about, but it had massive effects.
Yeah, so I think the fundamentals with the lease purchase model, you lease a truck from the trucking company. So essentially, like just like you would lease a car, you pay them a fee to lease the truck. You are then responsible for all the expenses that go along with with maintenance. So oil changes, that kind of thing. You're responsible for gas, any other expenses related to the truck, really. And basically, you get paid a fee for every load that you deliver. And so you're sort of an owner operator in that way. The truck's not really yours. You can't take the truck home. You can't use the truck for your own, you can't use the truck to drive for 5 different trucking companies. And, you don't have any of the flexibility that you would assume that someone who is just, who had a truck and was just driving, carrying loads that they wanted to. There are certainly people that do truly have that kind of discretion, but more often than not, it's a trucker working exactly like you would expect any other trucker to, or you would expect any other employee to be functioning. It's just, they're not getting any of the same benefits. They're not getting any of the protections that an employee gets. And sometimes that situation gets so bad that at the end of the week, you can work a full grueling week, 60, 70 hours driving trucks as a quasi owner operator in a lease purchase program. And at the end of the week, you owe your company money because something went wrong with your truck, or, there was an unexpected expense or whatever. All these things are sort of really predatory cycle.
Yeah. Aadi Golchha joining us. This is being reflected in the trucker shortage in America. There was a couple things happened at once. Once is the logistics in America exploded with things like Amazon and small package delivery. It just changed how the industry runs. The second thing that happened is all the baby boomers retired, like we saw in a whole lot of other industries. A lot of those guys have been working 20, 30 years. They all retired in the same kind of 10 to 15 year window. It's those younger generation of drivers coming in that are susceptible to things like the lease model operators, because the older guys, they had some income saved up, they had means to do things like that, so they use those stats and show those stats to the young guys, but then they make them lease the equipment. That feels predatory to me. I know it's predatory. I worked in the industry some. I don't know that there's a nice clean regulatory cure to that, though. I think some of that, though, is opening up more options for these drivers to have other regulatory options into an industry like trucking. But, and you touched on it on your piece, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, that is like its own world. It's a Byzantine regulation. Talk about it, because I don't know that folks realize the trucking industry and the freight movement industry in America is one of the most regulated things, and it's not exactly efficiently regulated at that.
So I think there's a lot of technicalities with how this industry is regulated. I think one of the key aspects of it is that there are, for example, there's limitations on how long a trucker can drive. That's probably the main one. But then what tends to happen is that what companies will do is they'll say, okay, well, if you can only drive, let's say 12 hours a day, then we're going to schedule exactly when you have to drive those 12 hours. And that can be, let's say, from midnight all the way through to noon. And if you didn't sleep during the day, if you don't feel safe to drive, whatever it may be, you still have to drive during those hours. So it might seem like a good idea in theory to say, we're going to mandate that you can only drive this many hours a day. But what it ends up doing is encouraging a system where of rigid scheduling. And that's not always a great idea in an industry where, you want safety to be paramount. You want drivers to be able to make common sense, individual decisions surrounding when they feel safe to drive, when they feel too tired to drive, and exactly when they feel at their best and most safe.
Aadi Golchha, this brings us back to where we started with the big picture economics, though. Incentives. How much is it? Let me rephrase it. How important is it for us, the average person doesn't know a lot about economics, when we're trying to sort through all the graphs and all the data and all the numbers and the big ticket items, to keep in mind that a lot of this is incentives driven? That's really a singular point in economics that is a little bit easier for folks like me to understand that doesn't know all the ins and outs, but it drives almost all this economic news. How important is it to focus on things like incentives when we're trying to discern economic news, whether it's big picture like the world economy or in a specific industry like this?
We have to, you sort of got it, right? There's what economists would call a lemons problem in this industry, where there's an asymmetry of information between the people who are signing up for these lease purchase programs or these independent contractor programs and what the companies are selling them. So the companies are well aware that this is something that 90+% of drivers are never going to turn a profit on. This is something without a financially viable exit path. this is something that is going to turn into a nightmare for the vast majority of people who sign up for it. But it's still sold as a dream. It's sold as, own your future, be your own boss. All these ads that I'm sure many of you will have seen, and it's if you're unsuspecting, you don't know too much about the industry, you're looking to you're looking to make a living in the trucking industry. If you come from an area where trucking has this perception of being a solid blue collar job, then perhaps you'll look at that ad and say, that sounds good. Let me sign up for it. Let me give it a shot. Risk free. What have I got to lose? And all of a sudden you can find in a couple of months you've lost your house, you've lost everything you have no way to get out of this, and you were sold a false bill of goods basically. And there's an asymmetry of information. And so I think the incentive structure at the moment is there's nothing to stop trucking companies basically from lying through their teeth and selling a false stream to unsuspecting truckers. And so if we do want to fix the incentive structure, it's not some sort of very technical, very complicated problem. This is something that I wrap up the piece with, is provide for a concrete distinction between independent contractors and employees. And this is something that we do here in New Zealand. This is something that Canada does, your neighbor to the north. This is something that the UK does. There's a several point test to determine whether a trucker is an independent contractor or whether or not they're an employee. And so there could be, like, for example, do you work exclusively for one company? Do you have any discretion over the hours that you work? Do you have any discretion over the routes? Do you have any discretion over what days you work? And if the answer to all of those points is no, then you have to be classified as an employee. You have to be given all the protections and benefits of an employee. If you get injured, they have to, you're entitled to worker protections. Your company should have to pay for Social Security, FICA, all the expenses. They can't dump all these things on you. You should be entitled to a minimum hourly wage. All of those things that employees get, all the protections that they have, should apply to you if you function as an employee. And if you're truly an independent contractor and that model is working well for you, you're happy with it, you're making money, then there's no reason you shouldn't be able to continue as an independent contractor. You just actually have to be one, not just what a piece of paper says.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha. And the reason we keep bringing this up, and we touched on it a minute ago, but I wanted to reiterate it. Yeah, that's trucking. People are like, oh, well, that's truck drivers. We've got the data on the gig economy and how it's exploding. This independent contractor, what it is, what it isn't, who should have protections. Not all independent contractors want those protections because they want their independence. Getting some kind of legal definitions of these things is going to be really important, because the gig economy isn't going to get any smaller. This independent contractor debate is going to continue. And if you're going to have economic viability, this is an area where regulation can really, really strangle the growth and the technology and quite frankly, the revolution in labor and people having some say in their own labor here, but still protecting people. This is a debate that's going to go on, and it's going to kind of change how we do labor economics in the future, isn't it?
So I think you touched on a very important point there, which is the potential of overregulation to kill innovation. And that's a big danger. And I'm as much of a free market proponent as the next guy. I came up reading Milton Friedman and Hayek and all those guys. And so I'm 99 times out of 100, I'm a proponent of deregulation and pushing for as much deregulation as possible, so we can make way for innovation, so we don't stifle growth. And all the cool technologies that make our lives so much better today than there were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. That being said, with the rise of the gig economy, I think I wouldn't want to stifle. I wouldn't want a situation where we're suddenly classifying Uber drivers as employees. We're classifying any type of workers on Fiverr as employees, and making and putting America in a position where all these worker protections are stifling those industries to the point where the gig economy completely collapses in on itself and becomes basically impractical. That's why I would be in favor of a test, right? So an Uber driver isn't an employee. They can choose when they want to drive. They can choose whether or not they want to work today or tomorrow or the day after. They have all these choices. They have all this discretion. They can work for another company. They can be gig employees for 50 different Uber or similar platforms. And so in that case, they truly are independent contractors. So yeah, I think there is a common sense way to do this that most developed countries around the world have already done, that doesn't stifle innovation, that doesn't stifle growth, but that does protect employees, and it doesn't have to be very complicated.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha, economics is complicated, though. That's why we bring folks like you on to explain them to people like me who doesn't understand them all that well. Give me one or two things you're watching that's going on right now that you're kind of paying attention to. Is it the inflation stuff? Is it China or the war in Ukraine? What's a couple things you're really paying attention to for not right now, but maybe the first of the year, the next couple of months, the next quarter, things you're trying to stay ahead of news-wise or you're watching for in the headlines that we can be watching out for as well?
So I think the one thing that I'm keeping a lookout for is the Fed's projections of where the interest rate is going. I think that they typically, and if you're not in the U.S., if you're most anywhere in the world, your central bank will probably be issuing predictions on where they forecast the interest rate is going to be in the next 6 months or a year or however far out your central bank issues predictions. And so I think that's one thing to keep an eye on, because those do change. They not only predict or they not only issue forecasts for how far it's going to rise, but also when they expect the interest rates to start falling again. And so if you're, for example, looking to buy a house, you want to know where the economic climate is going. I think that's sort of a really good way to keep track of what's going to happen in the next year or two. I think the other key thing to keep track of is unemployment statistics. There was in most countries around the world a severe labor shortage. A lot more job openings than there were workers. I know in New Zealand, for every unemployed person, there were 2 job openings. So that's how dire the worker shortage is here. And so I think one thing I will be keeping a very close eye on is what are the unemployment statistics looking like? Is the economy returning to full employment? And that typically is a good sign that we're in recovery mode.
Yeah, Aadi Golchha, always appreciate the conversation. You bring good insight. We'll be talking to you again, my friend. But until we get you back again, let folks know what you've got going on, where they can keep up with you, where they can follow you, until we get a chance to chat again.
So if you like podcasts, you can find my podcast. It's called The Economics Review. You can follow me on Instagram at Economics Review or on Twitter at Aadi Golchha.
Yep, Aadi Golchha, another one of our great Young Voices contributor. He's down in New Zealand. Sharp fella. Follow him. We'll definitely have you back, my friend. Thank you so much for the time today.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Don't want to let it pass over the holidays. This brutal winter storm, cold weather over a huge chunk. The map was insane. Other than California and the very tips of Texas and Florida, just about the whole country had some kind of a cold snap to deal with. Up in Buffalo, in that area, though, it's gone deadly. 26 dead in the Buffalo area as they get even more snow coming now, just pounding down. We want to make sure we make mention of this. Folks, disasters are going to come. Make sure you're prepared for these things. Now, things like this that just turns into act of God type stuff. Hurricanes, floods, winter storms to this level. There's not a lot you can do about it other than prepare for the best. If you're down in the South on the coast, you want to prepare for hurricanes. California, you want to prepare for earthquakes. If you live anywhere that gets snow, you got to prepare for a really bad snowstorm. My mom, God bless her, the trunks of our cars growing up, you only got about half the space because she over-prepared for everything. One time we got a flat tire and we didn't have anything to chalk the car with. So to this day, any of our vehicles that are up at mom and dad's house, you will find a brick in that vehicle somewhere to chalk the wheels in case you got to do a flat tire. Lessons learned, right? Now we laugh about it and tease mom a little bit because she packs like it's the apocalypse every time you go anywhere. But it's better to do it that way than the other way and not be unprepared. Make sure you do some basic disaster preparation around your home because you never know what may happen. You can have a tree fall out of the sky on your house. Changes of clothes, basic ability to get water, some communication, something. The old school radios, battery powered so you can hear what's going on in case the internet goes out. You never know what might happen down in North Carolina. Remember, the people went and shot up the substation. Whoever that terrorist is needs to be thrown in prison. But it even took down the cell towers, took out everything. People couldn't even use their cell phones. Are you prepared for that? Have some kind of battery operated radio so you can tell what's going on in the world. Blankets, extra change of clothes, cold weather gear if you're in a cold weather environment, water if you're in a hot weather environment. Lived out in Vegas. One thing we did is always make sure you had extra water in a car because you can get stuck out in Nevada in certain parts and there ain't nothing for a long, long ways. And if you don't hydrate, half a day will be very, very detrimental to your health. Be aware of your surroundings. These things in Buffalo, and it's tragic. Obviously, if you can do some charitable giving to these folks as they rebuild, please do so. Be aware of what's going on around you and what may happen. The government has lists. There's all kinds of lists online of how to do a disaster preparedness kit. Do you have a bug out bag of some kind in your home? The thing you can grab and get out of the house on a moment's notice if you need to. If you don't, you need to go put that together. Make sure you're taking care of yourselves, your loved ones, your household, your family, and your neighbors. I know when we have hurricanes and things like that, in our little neighborhood, the houses around us, I have a widow that lives one house across from me. Me and one of my other neighbors, we always take turns checking on her depending on the situation. Things like that. Find out who's around you. My kids know which neighbors to go to in case there's an emergency. Little things like this really, really matter. We can talk culture and politics, but mostly make sure you're taking care of yourselves and each other. Usually we do good news at the end of the program, but we wanted to end with that today. Make sure you're taking care of yourselves. Make sure you're prepared to keep you and your family safe, whatever the case may be. That'll do it for Heard Tell. We thank you for joining us. We've been doing kind of sporadic over the holidays. One thing is I had about 2 weeks where I had just an insane travel schedule. We're going to go through this week, get through the new year, hit the new year running. We do have some news coming up in the new year. We're anxious to share with you here soon. But until then, we're going to keep doing what we always do, turning down the noise of the news cycle, getting to the information we need to discern the times we live in. Make sure you check out ordinary-times.com, where I get to be one of the editors. Great writing there. My food website, bunch of people wrote in. They didn't know I did this. Food, faith, family, those kind of stories. No politics, no nonsense. I don't even put critical writing on there. It's all positive stuff. Yonder and Home. It's a Medium publication. Go to Yonder at Home on Twitter or just Google Yonder at Home. It'll come right up. We'll link to it in the show notes. That's my food writing website. People have really been asking me about that and enjoying that. Make sure you check that out. And of course, Heard Tell, all the podcasting platforms. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube. We'd love to have you on that platform. Also got some news about our radio partner. That's going to be changing in the new year. That'll be coming up in a couple of days. Really excited about that. Make sure you subscribe. iTunes, Spotify, wherever you're listening. YouTube if you want to watch. We sure do appreciate you. It will always be free. Doesn't cost you anything but a couple of clicks. If you could do us a favor, though, make sure you share us on your social media. Let folks know our program is worth their time. You can also check out all the extra stuff we do, the long form podcasts that we do. We got some more of those coming up soon that we've been working on. Also, the good talks, the breakouts of just the interview segments. We also have some special stuff on there. We did a December 7th piece. A lot of people liked, a lot of you reacted to. Make sure you check that out. So, till we see you again, wherever you are across the street or around the world, we hope you're well. We hope you are well fed. And we'll talk to you again soon for the next Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Somos la máquina.